Hello, everybody. We're just going to start with a little bit of webinar housekeeping. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so please hold your questions and stay muted till the end. We are recording this, and I will email it out to everybody tomorrow. And then again, just stay muted with your microphone off. So Backlog is putting on this webinar. Backlog is my company. We're an archival consulting firm based in St. Louis. And we really specialize in helping smaller institutions bridge the digital divide. So meaning bring collections online and create digital workflows. So a couple of the things that we do archival needs assessments. We also work with places to create digitization workflows. And then on top of that, and all the archives things we also do genealogy research. So again, I'm Emma. Backlog is my company. I started it in 2021 after being laid off during the pandemic. I found that a lot of places need just a little bit of help, but not necessarily a full-time person, or they can't afford a full-time person. And then I'm here with Jenna.
Hi, so I'm Jenna Duplessis. I'm a museum archivist, but for many years I was a university archivist before this. Today I'm going to be talking about something that's very close to my heart, is the intersection between archives and climate change. And we will talk a little bit about Project ARC, which was an organization that I was part of the founding member wave of. So I guess we'll just get started. Ready to go. So I want to orient us to where we are amid all of the confluence of disasters where we find ourselves. We just come out of the hottest month ever recorded. So as a profession concerned with bringing the past into the future, it's timely to talk about climate change. Our climate grows chaotic with more severe storms, heat waves, and sea level rise, becoming things to expect rather than far off possibilities. Now, I remember when I was a kid, we talked just about global warming, and it was something many centuries ahead of us that we needed to worry about. And now it is something that is here, that is something that we are witnessing, because it has happened gradually, but at the same time, much more quickly than we expected. A few years ago at a Society of American Archivists conference, a presenter on a panel about disasters talked about how the changing climate in Colorado had led to an explosion in the population of pine beetles, which destroy forests and make them tinder for wildfires, which were already on the rise due to extended dry seasons. Flooding and hurricanes are worse than we are prepared to handle, and any water event threatens our collections because of mold blooms. But I think we tend to think of climate change as being a coastal problem. We think about sea level rise. And really, no matter what type of environment or climate you are in, climate change and climate chaos is coming for us. So, and of course, there are disasters that are not related to climate change too, obviously, like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. So, I'm not attributing every single bad thing that could happen to an archival repository to climate change, but certainly the pattern of increased extreme weather is something to worry about. And that's where I'm sort of locating our talk. And this isn't just an objective overview of how archives and climate change are related and impact one another, but also an expression of the activities and community that are important to me personally. I've been involved in the climate activism space in archives for close to a decade, and each year the connection between the two is stronger. Today, actually, in the New York Times, there was an article about Appalshop, which is a cultural heritage organization in Kentucky that was severely damaged by flooding. And it was about the recovery efforts to get this cultural heritage organization functioning again, so that it could retake its place in the community. But it lost a percentage of its collections and its ability to continue doing its work. And there was a great quote from someone who was working at Iron Mountain, which was, working with Appalshop. She says, "We talk a lot about how climate change could impact our future. We don't spend a lot of time talking about how it could, or it is, in the case of Appalshop, impacting our past." The next slide, please. So briefly, how does climate change make the extreme weather worse? 90% of all the warming that is occurring is held in the oceans. Warmer oceans lead to stronger hurricanes and changes in weather patterns. Of course, we also have rising sea levels and stronger storm surges, which means that when there are more extreme storms, they're going to impact further inland. And of course, the changes to the climate also lead to changes in how animals and plants and fungi are, what their patterns of living are and where they are located. So you might have different insects, different fungi that are going to grow, or perhaps you never had to worry about mold randomly growing in your repository before, but now you do because it's much more humid in the summer. So it's been a very long time since my college physics class on climate science, but these are just a few notes on some of the factors that we have to consider in why climate change is making it more difficult to care for our collections. So longer dry spells are the flip side of the coin of having increased flooding in some places, and dry ground loses some of its capacity to hold water, which seems counterintuitive. So when it does rain, it's going to flood more easily. Adding heat to the complex systems of weather produces stronger storms. So one hot day or one hot season does not equal climate change, and weather is not climate, but this pattern of longer droughts, long dry and wet periods, and worse storms establishes the change in the climate. Next slide, please. So in 2022, the United States experienced 18 natural disasters that cost over $1 billion in damages each. There's an increased chance of floods at a higher magnitude, what we call like the 100-year and 500-year floods. Increased exposure of assets to disasters and increased vulnerability due to more extreme weather events is occurring. And pollution is a separate but related problem, which we're not going to get into, but of course, pollution is also getting worse. Deregulation is leading to worse pollution, and we have to worry about that as well. And this increased pollution not only threatens historical objects and buildings, but the people who keep them. What preservation is possible in times of mass death or illness, or when all of the archivists are laid off, which is not pollution related, but we will get into. What cultural heritage repositories might possibly close because they can no longer afford to operate after a disaster. And I mentioned the 100-year, 500-year floods. And so the US Geological Survey explains that it uses a 1% annual exceedance possibility, which they call the AEP, as the basis for the National Flood Insurance Program. So 1% AEP flood is what they consider a balance between protecting the public and really strict regulation and worry about flooding. So because the 1% AEP flood has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring or being exceeded in any year, and it has an average recurrence level of 100 years, it is referred to as the 100-year flood. So there's only a 1% chance of having a flood this bad in any particular year. And so therefore, one in 100, every 100 years, you would probably have a flood like this. But now we're having floods of this magnitude much more often. So hopefully I explained that okay. But if I didn't, talk to the US Geological Survey. They have very nice definitions on their website. So next slide, please. So this is just a graph of these increased damages that we're seeing over time. And so when the recording goes out, you can really pause and get into this. But you can see how there are more disasters. They are costing more money, and because they are creating a lot more damage each and every year. So next slide, please. Sorry, hopefully you can't hear. My cat has some opinions. So how are we responding to climate change? Well, quite literally, I'm part of an organization called Archivists Responding to Climate Change, or Project ARC, which is a very loose collective of archivists that we were founded in 2015, where we're non-hierarchical, we don't have officers or anything, and we just share resources and information about climate impacts on the profession. More recently, the Society of American Archivists founded the Repo Data Project, which sought to map every cultural heritage repository in the US, along with geological data about sea level rise. So there's also the Keeping History Above Water Conference, which shortly followed in 2016. It began in Newport, Rhode Island, and has moved to various places in the United States since. So it's a really broad collection of attendees who discuss how heritage institutions, community organizations, monuments, and historic sites are protecting history from climate change. Next slide, please. So this is from the Repo Data Project. So this is St. Louis. Each of these gray dots is an archival repository, and the purplish area is showing likely sea level rise. And I believe if you actually go into the repo data, this is just a screenshot from StoryMap. So that is interactive. So you can play with likelihoods of different, likelihoods of different levels of sea level rise, amounts of sea level rise. And you can see how the land will change. Next slide, please. So beyond those two communities, Project ARC and Keeping History Above Water, professional organizations are also showing increased concern about climate change. There's the Climate Change Heritage Network, which is a group of organizations. It includes the International Council on Archives. The Society of American Archivists put out an information brief on archives and the environment. The International Council on Museums and Sites, which you may have seen referred to as ICOMOS, has a lot of resources and publications on the issue. There have been special issues of the International Council on Archives journal, and as well as the Journal of Critical Library and Information Science on archives and climate change. And a few years ago, there was the Archives and the Anthropocene Colloquium, which was kind of happened in tandem with the Journal of Critical Library and Information Science issue. And in 2019, the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of the Association of College and Research Libraries dedicated their whole conference to climate change. Next slide, please. So on top of all of this, there are all of these environmental things that we have to worry about. And there's also more information being created than ever before. So we have a lot of work to do. But how do we protect more and more vulnerable collections without more archivists? How can we capture them, and how can we capture the memory of this historical epic? Well, the title of Emma's organization is very relevant. Backlogs. We are plagued by backlogs. We don't necessarily know what we have in our collections. So how do we triage what is the most vulnerable? What is it that we need to save if there is a disaster? And how do we do that work, again, without more archivists? So across the country, archive staffing numbers are inadequate. The National Archives actually has fewer staff now than it did in 1999. So we're really looking at existential threats. We're doing memory work, but this is a threat to humanity. So are we working at the end of memory? And how is it possible to continue to preserve history and memory and people's lives when those are the very things that are threatened? Next slide, please. So one way that we're sort of addressing the issues of the environment and, the possible impacts of the environment on our archives, as well as making things less horrible if there is a disaster, is through disaster planning, which of course requires that extra input of labor. So doing disaster planning and regularly revisiting and reviewing and revising your disaster plans builds collections resilience through information and preventative actions. You have to ask, what are you going to prioritize salvaging? Disaster planning allows you to design processes, locations, and resources all archives now. It's not ancillary to operations. Living in this time of many ecological disasters, we can't afford to not be engaging in disaster planning for our archives if we want to ensure that they actually persist into the future. So, for example, where I work, we have a colonial house museum that is located right on the water, right on a bay. And we have a plan for if there is a hurricane warning, to move all of the objects from the first floor, either to the second floor, or completely clear all of the collections out of the house and move them inland. And we review the plan and our responsibilities every year. And this is the most detailed plan of anywhere I've ever worked. There's a phone tree. We were all trained in how to take apart the colonial era clocks. So a disaster plan is not a one and done. Much like any sort of preservation, there's a lot of maintenance involved. So next slide, please. So why am I talking both about labor and about climate change? So just a couple of weeks ago, Erin Tansey published a Green New Deal for Archives through the Council of Library and Information Resources. And so she talks about the New Deal and all of the work that it created for people who needed work in the 1930s, as well as all of the cultural heritage resources that it generated that we still use. You know, things like the documentation of historic records and buildings and the Works Progress Administration photographs. There's a lot of cultural work being done and being funded, and that was of great value to us as a country. And so she argues that climate change and understaffing are a severe dual threat to archives, and advocates for increased public funding for archives because a New Deal style program could strengthen documentation of American cultural heritage. So there's a real possibility to address our cultural heritage crises today through similar investment. Next slide, please. So how have communities dealt with disasters before? And that's actually something that gets covered at the Keeping History Above Water conference. We're not just concerned with protecting our archives, we have to learn from them how our ancestors dealt with floods, fires, hurricanes. And we also have a responsibility to actually document communities that are undergoing change through oral histories or other types of documentation. And a community changes after a disaster, and there's displacement. And how does that affect the collective memory of that area? And a point that Erin Tansey makes in A Green New Deal for Archives also is that in a time of disaster, there are a lot of insurance claims, and those require documentation. Well, what happens if that documentation, whether it's something that's in your house or if it's government documentation, say at your city hall or at the state level, what happens if that is lost? So the loss of records impacts how governments, organizations, and schools function, as well as how families and communities remember and understand themselves. Next slide, please. So we're also documenting environmental history. Archives help us to remember an approximation of what happened before and what we've lost. Archival documentation of lost species, lost places, and altered habitats work in tandem with scientific research to tell environmental history. And we're currently in a situation where 69% of animal populations have died off since 1970. And about 875 plant and animal species have gone extinct or been extirpated, so gone extinct like in a local area since 1500, since the age of discovery. We're physically losing land through flooding. There's actually a community, an island community in Louisiana that has really had to evacuate and abandon their homes because it has flooded too much. It was very low-lying land. So we physically lose the land and the trees, the animals, and our experience of them, and we also lose the communities that live there. So the reason I have a picture of these little owls is that this particular owl is the Cactus ferruginus, I hope I'm saying that right, pygmy owl. It's native to the southwestern United States. And it was just a few weeks ago listed as threatened. It was listed and threatened in Arizona until 2006, and then there was a reversal of that decision. Sorry, it was listed as threatened. And so that in order to protect its population. And so the population was coming back, and then that decision to protect them through the threatened status was reversed, and that benefited land development in the desert. And so now this population is threatened again. So we are living in what is being called the sixth mass extinction. The fossil record tells us that there have been 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history, which are generally impacted by huge geological or astronomical events, like a meteor. This new one is called the Holocene or Anthropocene extinction, and this is caused by human activity, not just climate change, but destruction of habitat, overhunting, things like that. And there's always an awareness of death and mortality in the archives, an awareness of something that no longer exists. And right now there is so much passing away for us to try to document and to remember. Next slide, please. So, we also have a lot of new social movements that are dedicated to thinking about archives. Earth Day just had its 50th anniversary in 2020. And having archives of social movements gives grassroots movements later on perspective on the history that exists in opposition to history of institutions. So you might have, city documents, university documents that are really well preserved in archives. But if you don't have the archives of the social movements that maybe protested particular policies or advocated for other ones, then you're only getting part of the story. And there is such an explosion of social movements and activism that those are things that need to be documented too. Next slide, please. So to turn our attention a little bit, I guess, the work that we're doing as archivists also impacts the climate. We're using massive amounts of energy, particularly with server farms and digital storage. We're creating a lot of waste. I'm pretty sure that barrier board isn't recyclable. How do you recycle a Hollinger box? There's many different types of materials. Both the physical storage and digital storage are using a ton of physical space and a lot of energy to keep the servers cool. Also, we travel a lot, and our collections travel a lot, either for conferences, exhibits, and just commuting. So there's an SAA article a couple of years ago that came out called Toward Environmentally Sustainable Digital Preservation, which addressed methods for improving sustainability in digital projects and being more aware of the energy that one uses. But of course, physical storage requires a ton of resources to cool as well. And we have to ask what space we're taking from other community needs with the storage of large collections. For example, does a centrally located warehouse take space away from safe housing? Does staff not have enough workspace in a building because so much of it is dedicated to collections? The travel of people and goods, as I said, has massive carbon footprints as well. The increase in virtual meetings and conferences helps, but of course there's energy use associated with running everything over Zoom. And nothing that we can do is free of impacts, but we can work to reduce them. And in the climate change activism community and just general discourse about climate change, people ask, well, what impact does one person's choices possibly have? What could that possibly have? And yeah, there is an argument that one person bringing their reusable mug or reusable shopping bag once doesn't really, it is not a change on the scale that we need. But we're all working at institutions, and those institutions have the possibility of creating much more impact than any one of us on our own. A couple weeks ago, I saw a presentation at SAA of case studies related to archives explorations of how HVAC alterations could save energy. You know, like if we brought in what's considered our acceptable range, heat, humidity, is that going to save energy? There was one archivist who calculated the carbon savings of that acceptable range of temperature and humidity in the collections was basically equal to the carbon savings that the institution would have if staff could stop driving to work. So you can really think outside the box about when it comes to how your institution can possibly decrease its carbon footprint. You know, what work can be done from home, especially if your staff cannot live in the community where your archive is actually located. Next slide, please. So things to consider in your own repositories. You know, as I've said, there's no silver bullet to zeroing out the impact that we have on the climate, but there are things that we can do. We can think about our server energy expenditure, HVAC, scheduling digital processes, our supply usage and waste. You know, what is it that we can reuse? What is it that we can recycle? What choices can we make about you know, paper versus polypropylene in storage materials? How can we protect our collections, you know, with their housing and with their environment more sustainably? And when it comes to traveling and commuting, perhaps in your organization, establish best practices for conference travel, as well as shipping, you know, like loans for exhibits. You know, designing hybrid and remote work arrangements are great for the climate, and also great for people. And people who have that flexibility are able to deal with illness and disability better, deal with caregiving responsibilities better, and not have to be, you know, in a car or on a train as much time. And since the pandemic, I have really seen that hybrid and remote work arrangements really benefit people with disabilities. And you know, anything that is great for all of your workers is probably going to be great, especially great for bringing in a wider swath of potential employees who might not be able to apply for your position if you were requiring them to be on site all the time. So just things to think about. And also, what local policies and actions do you want to support? Oh, and actually, I think, Emma, this might be on the next slide. Sorry, can you go to the next slide? I can't remember. Yeah, so I was like, I can't remember how we organized this one. So are there particular things going on at City Hall that your organization supports or doesn't support? And what types of collaboration or resource sharing or partnerships can you build with other institutions, whether they're other cultural heritage organizations or community groups or schools or any other type of institution that will build resilience in disaster? And I guess the most important thing I think we can do is write our disaster plans now. There's a whole body of literature on resilience and environmental degradation, and it's really community building that allows for the persistence of the activities and systems and institutions that we care about in difficult times. So it's, yeah, we're in trying times, and it's really vital in these times to plan for when disaster happens. Who are we going to talk to? Who are our allies, and also who are we also going to be able to help? So next slide, please. So I don't want to just overwhelm with bad news and tasks, because I think there's hope to be found. You know, climate change is here, but we don't need to give up. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think that any sort of ideological purity is not very useful in these times. Doing something as well as you can is better than doing something than doing nothing because you can't do it perfectly. And I think we can all make choices that allow us and our institutions to tread more lightly on the earth. And we can also build resilience. And I think that is a word that gets thrown out a lot, but resilience is something that is built intentionally. It's not just something that you have to exhibit when times are hard and you're forced to be strong. Resilience is something that you can build in a community, whether it's communities of similar organizations or communities, organizations that are just in your region, to figure out how you're going to deal with this new world that we're creating. So I think that is everything for me. I welcome your questions and feedback.
Yeah. But first, will you tell us a little bit about the next webinar in 2 weeks?
So in 2 weeks, I'm going to be talking about the interconnectedness of all the different cultural heritage cousin professions. So how do libraries, archives, and museums talk about similar concepts differently? What do they value separately in their institutions? How they think about their collections? That sort of thing.
And I guess that's in 3 weeks. In 2 weeks, we have one on family Bibles and genealogy. But I just put together our fall webinars today. Jenna will be presenting on how to order and more information about archival supplies. I know they seem pretty straightforward to shopping, but it's not.
Yeah. When I started my first archives job, I was like, what does buffered mean? I didn't learn any of this in school.
Yeah.
Well, just things like that. And I feel like I've learned a lot from being kind of a scrappy, often solo archivist of, what to buy, how to do things in an affordable fashion, and the chemistry that we don't necessarily learn in library school.
Oh yeah. And then she's also doing one on 19th century handwriting. She did a very popular one in June on just handwriting over the years in general. And we had a couple hundred people register, so we thought we'd do a follow-up and go micro on some of the more common ones. Does anybody have any questions at this time? Feel free to unmute and throw it out there or put something in the chat. This is something that Jenna is very passionate about, and she'd really be happy to, I'm sure, engage with you on this topic. All right, so I have a question.
Okay.
You were talking about the house museum on the coast that you guys have.
Yeah.
How long would that evacuation take to clear everything out of the first floor? Do you guys have it quantified?
I don't think so, but just based on conversations we've had, I have not been here for an evacuation yet. I think it would probably take the better part of a day. It also depends on whether we're just moving stuff to the second floor, or if we have to move it to the ballroom of another house. And I guess fortunately, the house that we would have to evacuate is one of the smaller ones. It's not one of the large mansions that we would have to move a ton of stuff out of. But we don't have an off-site storage facility or like a warehouse, so all these collections need to go somewhere and need to still be cared for, despite whatever is happening outside. So we do have a location in one of the other houses so that's already a safe climate control and secure place to house the collections.
Okay.
But obviously, I also know that not every institution has that ability. So that's where building a partnership is really important with perhaps an organization that does have a facility, or you could share some sort of resources. Perhaps you all go in together on a storage unit that you can fill in one of those climate controlled storage complexes that you fill if there's going to be an immediate threat to a particular building in your community. I'm just spitballing.
Okay. Okay, I think Alex has a question.
Yes, I feel weird having you talk to a black screen, so I'll turn my video on too. I know you're talking primarily about archives and collections, but I was wondering if you had any information or knew anything about preservation of built environments, historical homes, historical districts, and what's sort of being done in that realm with increasing cultural disaster.
Yeah, so the ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments that I mentioned, a lot of their publications are focused more on built environment, big seaside forts. Actually, one of the presentations at the first conference I went to was from Scottish archaeologists who are trying to protect, I think, like Iron Age or Bronze Age archaeological sites that are near the ocean. So that like keeping history, actually most of keeping history above water is focused on the built environment. So me being there as an archivist was a little bit like, there weren't a ton of archivists there. Oh gosh, let me think. Of course, all I can think of is Historic Environment Scotland, because those are the people that were doing the presentation. There's the International Council on Monuments, as well as the museums one, which has almost the same abbreviation. I think it's still ICOM, like International Conference of Museums or something like that. So I know that the, oh gosh, completely lost my train of thought. Sorry. The whatever that is, I can't think, the International Museums Organization. I know they are part of some climate heritage networks as well. And so I think that also would include like historic houses and the built environment. The I'm just like blanking on all these organization names. National Trust for Historic Preservation. And then I guess just the National Trust in the UK are also primarily focused on protecting the built environment, not just like collections. That's all I can think of right now. I'm sure I'll think of 7 more, like as soon as I stand up. But I think, yeah, the International Council on Monuments is probably has the biggest publication output in this area. I know I have a publication from them from like 2015 or 2016 called Heritage Under Threat that was specifically about places.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Oh, and also I pulled together some links and also some sources. Yes, I was gonna say, and Emma actually made them into a nice web page. So the link that she just put in the chat collects some of the where I got some of the facts and figures, as well as links to publications and organizations that I mentioned.
Yeah. And then tomorrow I will send out an email to everybody with this recording, and I'll include that link in it as well, assuming I spelled everything correctly. Hyphen archivist sounded like a really great idea until I had to like spell it all the time, and I know how to spell it, but it turns into visits more than I would like to admit.
Oh gosh, I just wanted to also really encourage everyone to read the New York Times article from today about Apple Shop, because it was just very timely that it came out today, and I was just immediately reading it upon waking up.
Okay. If there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap. But thank you everybody for coming. I know I learned a lot. So
thank you for being here. Thank you for ruminating on this very big topic. But hopefully we can dwell in possibility.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Bye. Thanks.